Well, you have been a pioneer in the space of AI much longer than you've been running Insitro. What drew you to biology, and why in 2018 did you decide to start this company?
So I was actually, is this mic on? Okay, yeah. I was actually drawn to biology quite a while ago. My interest in biology dates back to the early 2000s when the first interesting biological data sets were coming out, and the data sets that were at the time available to machine learning scientists were actually kind of lame. Like, how excited can you get around about spam filtering or newsgroup classification? And biology had really interesting data sets that were also addressing an aspirational mission. The first data set that I worked on was actually tuberculosis epidemiology. So think of it as a very, very early precursor to what then happened on COVID a few years ago, right? And it's just such both an aspirational mission, because you're actually making a positive impact on people's lives if you're successful in profound ways. If you don't have your health, then what do you have? And then on the other side, from a methodological perspective, that interplay between what the data has and the complexity of human biology, which is an evolved system. It's not an engineered system. There's so much there that we just don't even know exists. And so you keep discovering new things that just no one knew, which is like a super exciting way to, spend your days. Like, wow, I learned something new about nature that I didn't know.
That's amazing. And what did you see back when you started Insitro that made you feel like this was the time?
So even back at the time, it was clear to me that AI was about to transform the world. I mean, this was around 2016, 2017, and I could already see the exponential curve, even though it was in the early days, long before GPT and so on came about. But you could see that it was happening. But it wasn't happening in the life sciences. And one of the reasons that is the case is because the kind of quality data that we need in order to drive machine learning and AI models didn't exist. And at the same time, as I looked around me at the tools that had been developed during the time that I was with Coursera, things like CRISPR and differentiated stem cells that can mimic neurons and cardiac cells and liver cells and perturbations of different types and super resolution microscopy, and it was like, wow, we can generate the data that we need. And so those two together provide an unparalleled opportunity.
Interesting. So it was a lot of the experimental technology that was being built.
Yeah. And when we started Insitro, people were like, why are you doing this wet lab thing? That's just like so hard. And you've never built a wet lab, which by the way is true, I hadn't, and it was really hard. You should just do purely computational because you're good at it and it's way cheaper. You could do it all in the cloud and you don't even need a lab. And I was like, yeah, but the data that we need just is not there. And so we can try and make do with piling up little dribs and drabs of data that were generated in random scientific publications and pretending that that pile is fit for purpose. But in almost all cases, it's not. And so you really need to bring together the data generation engine with the data analysis and interrogation engine, the AI part, and have them not only coexist, but also kind of synergize so that you're creating data that's fit for purpose for AI and doing the AI that's fit for purpose for the biology.
Where do you think we're bottlenecked now? Even within data, how much of it is scaling up existing technologies, experiments that we have now versus do we need more physical innovation? Do we need new kinds of experiments to capture the context that we want?
I mean, every time you measure biology in new ways, you discover things that you didn't know before because, like I said, biology is just this remarkable thing that continues to surprise us. But at the same time, I think what we have measurements of today at the scale that we have today is definitely enough to make a big dent in some really serious diseases. So what we think of it is in terms of horizons. What diseases can we tackle today with the tools that we have today, the data modalities that we have access to today, recognizing that in 3 years there will probably be new data types and new ways of interrogating biology that hopefully the kind of foundation that we've built can then be extrapolated to that next tranche of advancements. Because at the end of the day, what we have is sort of like a process for how do you take data modalities, how do you create them in your lab, how do you interrogate them using AI, how do you take the insights and turn them into medicines. And that, every time we take a new modality in, we just apply that same thing in a rinse-repeat kind of way. And so I'm confident that we'll be able to continue to do that as ways of measuring biology continue to evolve.
Building the machine that builds the machine.
Building the machine that builds the machine, that's exactly right.
How do you think about choosing diseases? Something that you said in your presentation is, the big opportunity is for AI to redefine how we think about disease, like in the same way that genetics did for cancer. What disease areas of human biology do you think we most misunderstand today that in 20 years we'll look back and say that was crazy?
So first of all, let me just highlight what you said about cancer. Not that long ago, 10, 15 years, breast cancer used to be viewed as one disease. And we now understand that breast cancer has very distinct subtypes, every one of which now has a very different treatment. And that is what has allowed us to move away from the standard of care being the lowest common denominator, which is chemotherapy that basically just kills every cell that's dividing, so it's totally indiscriminate, to something that is much more targeted, much more precise, with much better outcomes. And now the survival rates for even metastatic breast cancer are over 90%, 5-year survival. And that's an amazing transformation. What we need to do is to do that same kind of deconvolution for other forms of diseases. And I would say pretty much every complex disease, certainly every disease of aging, not the maybe Mendelian sort of diseases that you're born with a very, very high penetrance mutation driving disease, but diseases that pretty much all of us are going to get, they're all heterogeneous. They're all a combination, a multifactorial thing where you're going to need different treatments for different people. You need different combinations probably for different individuals. And we're never going to get there if we think about disease based purely on symptomatic manifestations in the same way that we used to think about breast cancer as being a lump in your breast.
I think cancer is interesting, both because survival rates have gone up, but also it's one of the areas with the lowest likelihood of approval and a lot of commercial challenges. Do you worry that the model of drug development needs to change to accommodate more precise definitions of disease?
Well, I think for sure it needs to change. I think there is an increasing openness in regulatory agencies to accept the fact that there are different subtypes of disease and regulatory pathways to demonstrate that if you're treating a subpopulation, there's a good rationale for that. I'm not saying it's clean sailing and that it's all been figured out, but I think there is a push towards AI-based biomarkers, which allow you both to identify the right patient population, but maybe equally importantly, measure the success of your treatment in ways that are not based solely on patient-reported outcomes that have huge variability, placebo effects, and so on, but are actually, for example, measuring neurodegeneration using the amount of amyloid beta that is cleared from your brain. That is a quantitative biomarker. There is, minimal placebo effect because it's a biological process, and you can now start to get early approvals because you don't have to wait 10 years for clinical outcomes like cognitive decline or death to manifest. And we're seeing that, for example, in the MASH liver fat space as well, where we can now quantify actual fibrosis and liver fat using technologies like MRI versus waiting for downstream clinical outcomes like, are you getting a liver transplant, which takes 5 years?
Yeah.
And a much larger trial because you're based on events, and so you need a lot of patients to see an event in 5 years.
Yes, well, I think you're touching on something that I think a lot of AI founders who come into bio for the first time have to grapple with, which is the feedback loops for drug discovery are incredibly long,
they are.
Very expensive. How do you think about the right business model, the right way to sort of finance these companies? Do you have to take on end-to-end drug development?
I mean, you don't have to, but if you want to build a truly generational company today, you're not going to get away with sort of picking kind of a slice and hoping that people build everything around that slice. So I think at the end of the day, in order to build a truly great company in this space, you have to go end-to-end in the same way that Amazon eventually went end-to-end as well, to take an analogy from a different space, right? And I think that is absolutely true, but that doesn't mean it's the only business model in which one can engage. And so one of the things that we have done at Insitro is we've built these incredible platforms. And those platforms are so productive that we recognize that, especially at our stage of development, we can't take all of the capacity and all of the fruits of the platform and develop it all the way into the clinic ourselves because we just don't have the money, we don't have the people, we don't have the time. However, because of this abundance, we can go and partner pieces of the platform with other organizations that don't have the capabilities that we've built. And so you can think of it as a dual business model. There is the pipeline piece of it, which is a more traditional sort of, we're going to take our programs all the way through and hopefully, into approval. And then there is the, here's our platform capabilities. You, pharma, biotech companies that don't have this, would you benefit from leveraging this piece of what we've done? And coming back to Amazon as an analogy, it's kind of how AWS came about.
Yeah. Well, you and Insitro have probably done some of the most creative deal making with pharma. You just announced this partnership with Lilly.
Yeah.
How do you think about working with companies like that in terms of value sharing, what you should be doing, what they should be doing? What kind of organization have you had to build to do all of these things, right? Part tech company, part BD platform company, part pharma company.
Yeah, so first of all, I'm blessed to have a wonderful corporate development and strategy team that is willing to really think outside the box. And we are fortunate in having been able to craft partnerships with some pharma companies that are able to think outside the sort of, tried and true, this is how we partner with a biotech company. Basically, they make an asset, we license the asset at phase 2, and thank you very much. And it turns out that once you have two parties that are both willing to think differently, you come up with really creative business models. And the two partnerships that we've crafted with Lilly, I think, are great examples of that. There's the one that we announced earlier this week, which is, like I said, Lilly is basically making available to us what is considered to be the crown jewel of most pharma companies, which is this pharmacological database, which is decades worth of meticulous data collection. And Lilly, I would say, has been particularly good at making sure that the data is collected consistently and with very high quality, which is very rare in pharma. Oftentimes it's like dribs and drabs on different people's, whatever spreadsheets on their laptops. And Lilly has done a really good job of creating a high quality data set. And then they're giving us this crown jewel. And not only to us, those models that we're building together are going to be available to little baby biotechs in the Lilly ecosystem that would never be able to afford access to, and they don't have the data, they can't build the machine learning models. And so we're basically elevating an entire ecosystem of companies together of both Lilly partners and Insitro partners. So, talk about being creative. I think it's a really incredible partnership that is following on top of the previous partnership that we had with them, which is we had some really great targets in the modality that we don't have capabilities, specifically antibodies, and there's a limit to how many modalities you can become expert at. So we're expert at small molecules. We're pretty darn good at RNA therapeutics, but we didn't build out antibodies because, that would have been yet another build. And Lily's like, we're really good at that. Do you want us to make your molecules? It's like, yes, please. And they're doing it effectively for free with modest downstream economics. And it's our program, and you never see that kind of when we announced this, my CFO's phone just didn't stop ringing because every friend that she's made in the ecosystem was like, wait, how did you do that? And can we do that too? So we're very grateful, and it was really, again, thinking creatively.
That's amazing. Well, I know we don't have a ton of time, but maybe to get to a question that I know a lot of folks in the audience are interested in. You were famously an early executive at Calico, Google's anti-aging company. How do you think about longevity in the context of disease, and how much of what we're working on today should be bound by what we think of as degenerative disease versus improving lifespan and health span?
So first of all, I think it's really important to distinguish lifespan and health span. I don't think any of us would necessarily want to live to 140 as a bedridden, really sick individual. So I think of it more as improving health span than improving lifespan. And sometimes, in many cases, lifespan increases when one of the reasons lifespan has increased so much in the US up until recently, by the way, is because we had a series of interventions, one after the other. Vaccines. Yes. one of the greatest inventions ever made by mankind. The statins that have hugely reduced the incidence of cardiovascular disease. I mean, one invention after the other has allowed us to increase health span and subsequently lifespan. And I think that's where we should focus. Now, that doesn't mean that we should be thinking of this as a game of whack-a-mole where each disease is its own thing and you beat this one and then you go on to the next one and it's an entirely new journey. Really, a lot of diseases share a common etiology, a common biology. For example, inflammation, hugely important across multiple diseases. And so oftentimes when you really get to the root cause and are not just doing things that are around the margins of addressing symptoms, but really addressing the root cause, that root cause is often shared across indications. And so you end up either with the same drug being able to serve multiple diseases or with the same, at least same set of insights being able to allow you to address one thing after the other. And so, for example, in our work on metabolic disease, we find that, not surprisingly, the consequences of the Western diet that unfortunately many of us engage in have to do with dysregulation of glucose and lipid metabolism. And that in turn allows lipids to be internalized into cells that they shouldn't be in, and those cells then become pro-inflammatory, and then the inflammation kicks in, and that's where inflammaging comes about. Turns out if you're not engaging in the Western diet, inflammaging, the inflammation that accompanies aging, is not an inevitability. There's some healthy populations that don't have inflammatory responses when they age because they don't eat the same way that we eat. So I think understanding those root causes in a biologically grounded fashion, which is what we can do by measuring biology at its roots rather than allowing clinician to define disease for us, is where you can really get to some of those differentiated insights that could hopefully make a dramatic difference.
Well, now you have to tell us what we should be eating.
I think I cannot tell you something you don't already know. We should all be eating more fruits and vegetables, more fiber, less sugar. Anyway, so I have no unique insight there. We all know what we should be eating, it's just that we don't.
But science says so too. Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Daphne, both for the presentation and for this Q&A.
Thank you.